Hey, what's up, guys? More than any other sport, football, both college football and the NFL, has an issue with strength of schedule. It really does. When you think about it, it's the sort of thing that people talk about a lot. It's the sort of thing that gets a lot of talk and a lot of play on sports talk radio and has really for a long time. It's also the sort of thing that most people who are fans of the sport really don't think that much about, right? Now, some of us do, right? I went to BYU. The year I was born, 1984, BYU won the national championship, and it was controversial because they didn't play anybody. Now, I'm not going to tell you that they did because they really didn't. I mean, when you go back and look at the schedule, the Western Athletic Conference in 1984 was not exactly a powerhouse. BYU also played, like Pitt to start off the season? Now, Pitt was ranked third, but wound up having a losing season. BYU played Michigan in the Holiday Bowl and barely won. This was a Michigan team that I think had lost 5 times already that season. So, strength of schedule is a problem, and is something that creates this sort of really wacky thing in college football where certain schools will end up being rated high because of their reputation, but not necessarily because of their ability to always beat good teams. And we know that because they're not always playing good teams. I mean, let's go take a look. So we'll go over here to the screen view, and let me make myself a little bit smaller here. This is what happens when you do this first thing in the morning and you haven't checked beforehand. So more professionalism here on this channel will make that a little bit better. That looks a little bit better, I think. We'll look here first at Michigan, who just won the national championship, right? Now, I mean, the Big Ten is good. This is good college football, right? They had to beat Penn State, had to beat Ohio State. That's a real hard game. Absolutely. Two of the best teams, probably the 2 best teams in the country this last year. They had to beat Iowa. I watched this game and was talking with people on Reddit. That was a lot of fun. And then, of course, they had to beat Alabama. Alabama in the Saban era is one of the great dynasties of all time. And then had to beat a really good Washington team in a game that really wasn't as close as it could have been. This Iowa game, by the way, was a lot of fun because of how good Iowa's defense is. And Michigan still managed to score 26 points. But lost in between this are some of these other games that we don't talk about. Like they played East Carolina, right? East Carolina, which wound up winning 2 games this past season against less than stellar competition. They played, speaking of old WAC teams, they played UNLV. UNLV had a season. They went 9-5 overall, and that was playing in the weak Mountain West, right? And they played against Bowling Green, which is one of those mid-American schools. I mean, it's just ridiculous that Michigan ends up playing a team like this, right? And then they play good old Rutgers, another Big Ten school that never really seems to do anything. So you can sort of see what I'm talking about, right? If you look at the worst part of the schedule, you start asking yourself, especially some of these non-conference games, like, what are they doing? Why are you playing a team that's so bad? Now, we know the reason why, right? You schedule patsies in your non-conference games if you're like a big blue blood school because you need to win. If you lose, like Michigan's done in the past, then you're really in trouble, right? But the funny thing is when we look through the history of college football, we see the same pattern of teams playing like nobodies, right? My favorite example of this is not a team you've probably heard of. It's Hawaii in 1924 and 1925, right? So if you start doing research on the history of college football and on some of the more legendary dynasties that once existed, you'll read about this Hawaii team that they consider to be the wonder teams, the 2 years Hawaii went undefeated. Yeah, they went undefeated, but who are they playing? The 13th Field Artillery? This is in 1924, right? Honolulu Town Team, Hawaii Army. They played Honolulu Town Team again. They did play the Pearl Harbor Navy team, right? I mean, now I know maybe like the playing field was a little bit more even in 1924, but I mean, these are not like stellar opponents, right? In the end, they ended up beating Colorado, which is a team that came in undefeated in the Poi Bowl in Hawaii. One of the things you'll notice, too, is that all of these technically are home games, and you'll also notice that it's all local teams from Hawaii. Of course, the reason why is because there was no direct air travel to Hawaii at that time. You had to go by boat, right? It's kind of hard to schedule, like, meaningful teams when that's the case. So the question turns into, like, how could this team have ever would ever lose to anybody, right? I mean, unless you happen to have a really good Pearl Harbor Navy team. You go look at them in 1925. This is the season where they are awesome and winning like 86-0 against Hawaii National Guard, or 68-0 against the 11th Field Artillery, or 74-0 against Helani Athletic Club. I mean, That's what I'm talking about, right? They're barely scored upon, but when you look close at this, they're playing like a bunch of teams that are almost like high school level teams. That's the problem, right? It's hard to say that this was an awesome, excellent team when they're playing like nothing, right? Now, they did play Colorado Agricultural, again, at home. They played Occidental on the road, so they finally got out of the islands to play this game. Look at how much time you have in between, though. This is for travel, right? You have like 2+ weeks in between games to get around, right? So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at older seasons. You see the same thing in 1946, right, with Notre Dame, one of your more legendary teams until you kind of look close. I'll say, okay, so, Illinois was all right that season, but then you run into teams like Pitt that had an awful season, and it's not so impressive that Notre Dame won 33-0. Yeah, they beat Purdue by a huge amount, but Purdue had a really lousy season, right? Now, I know that they can't come up with much ahead of time, right? I know that you can't, have this schedule put together that's miraculously perfect and all that stuff when you're scheduling 2 or 3 years out, right? But I mean, we could solve that problem if we didn't have this college football landscape in which, we had teams making up their own non-conference schedule, and, the teams that you're playing year in and year out, sort of don't exist, right? There's a better way of doing this if, for example, you were going to create a simulation environment and you wanted to have scheduling that was at least somewhat equal and somewhat even and would be difficult to get through during the season instead of just walking over a bunch of teams. Notre Dame in 1988 is commonly remembered as the last real national champion. And the reason why is because they had to play and beat Miami, who was number 1 at the time. They had to beat USC, who was number 2 at the time. And then in their bowl game, they had to beat number 3 Virginia, right? They also had to beat Michigan at the very start of the season in what was a really tight game. But the thing that you forget about is that they also played against Air Force, who went 5-7 somehow. They played against Navy, who went 3-8. Right, it's teams like this that you see over and over again. They beat Rice, but Rice had an 0-11 record that year, right? I mean, this stuff is impressive, but it's not so impressive when you see them playing against teams that were really lousy, right? So it's another thing you have to keep in mind. Now, this problem doesn't just exist in college football. It exists in the NFL as well, and you can see looking up at the tab kind of where we're going next. I don't have a copy of it right now. My dad has a copy of the 1973 Sporting News professional football guide, right, that he got when he was a teenager, sort of in commemoration of that 72 Dolphins season. As I recall, there is a part in the guide where it talks about the schedule that the Miami Dolphins had to face, right? They faced a schedule that was not particularly difficult, and that's one of the reasons why they went undefeated that season. You're not going to see a whole bunch of it here on the Wikipedia page for the Dolphins, but you might ask yourself a couple of questions about how a team that went 3-3 in the preseason suddenly won 14 games in a row plus 3 playoff games. There was a Reddit post here 10 years ago that talks about this. And when they look at the Dolphins' schedule, they notice that their teams that they played against had a combined 0.367 winning percentage. In fact, two of these teams had winning records. The Chiefs and the Giants both went 8-6, so barely, right? Compare that to the 2007 Patriots, and you can see there's a huge difference. So the Patriots also were playing teams with a winning percentage under 500. Since they played the Dolphins twice. Dolphins went 1-15 that year. I remember that. Right, but at this, the point remains that it might be a little bit easier for the Dolphins if they kind of luck out with the schedule and play a lot of weak teams. Again, you can't know this necessarily ahead of time, but there's a real argument here for a balanced schedule and for a schedule that in which we don't have to worry so much about strength of schedule. Now, I say this a lot because I come from the baseball world. Baseball has changed over time thanks to interleague play. If you go before 1997 and you look at schedules, though, for the most part, they were even. There's a little bit of a glitch every single time you get expansion and they do weird things with the schedule. When divisions came in and stuff like that, things were a little bit odd. But for the most part, you would play the same amount of times against the other teams in your league, which makes it easier to look and determine which team is good and which team is bad. It's much harder to do when the teams are playing against different teams and everything is uneven. So anyway, it's something to keep in mind, especially as we set a project up. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this subject. Let me know down below, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.